on the actual school name, it should bring up a drop down, and then you should be able to change the school within the document itself. Hopefully. If it's a PDF, then it won't work.
No.
Okay, so we can, yeah. So it has to be in the Excel form, so we can get that fixed for you, but you should have a paper copy of it.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so that's all the attachment is.
Thank you. We'll get the file. Ms. Winchester will send the file on my behalf to the board members.
Okay. So we have quite a few slides to go through. As Mr. Hyde pointed out, I'm the senior manager of staffing. Mike, for those of you who may not know, we handle all the school allocations, and then also position control for the entire district. So the very first title slide, I have on there that all intended staffing allocations are dependent on available funding. It's super important to know. Obviously, we have this idealistic staffing model, but everything is dependent on funding and how much money we do actually have available to us. I know Mr. Pitts, when he's presented before, said that one teacher at every single one of our schools is almost $10 million. So that's kind of what I just wanted to restate for all of you, that, you know, it's the magnitude of staffing is pretty big in most cases. So also, as we move forward, we're going to talk about how we're in a little bit of uncharted territory for Polk, not necessarily for everyone, because some school districts are currently doing what we're enacting. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question with your first statement.
Okay,
Sorry.
sure.
Staffing allocations are based on budget, but there are guidelines for staffing allocations.
Correct.
So we can't say you don't get staff because we have no dollars.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
well, that's what I heard, so I
Okay,
wanted you
I
to
apologize.
clarify that.
Yeah, no, I apologize. No. So correct. We have, you know, class size laws, and there are certain requirements that we have to meet. But we do have, you know, in staffing plan, every single, and even previous models of our staffing plan do say that it is based on funding. But we'll talk about that as we go through. And then, as I was saying, we are kind of venturing out with new models that we're taking on, and then obviously revamping our current model. So we are still trying to develop as we go. So there are things that I might present that may change in the future, but this is the roadmap and where we're trying to get to eventually. So the first slide, this is the staffing plan document, should have been provided to you in the PDF form. So the entirety of the staffing plan, I'm not going to show it in the slide because it's, I think, 40 pages. It used to be 80. So we consolidated it. But there are certain changes in the beginning that are just these first few bullet points, like formatting changes, removal of watermark, pictures, miscellaneous pictures, consistency in the headings and different sections. So updating the years throughout. Those are just general changes and updates that we would have needed to make. And the main changes that are actually that we're going to talk about a little further are going to be the appeals process and then the singularity model staffing plan. So those are what the next slides are about. But the first few on here are just kind of updates and realigning the staffing plan, since it kind of hasn't been revised in a while, to just what we're currently practicing. So the first one they're going to talk about is the removal of the appeals process. So historically, we've evaluated enrollment changes at reappointment time when we're projecting for the next year, and that's pretty much it until 8th day. So then once 8th day count comes, we reevaluate the actual enrollment that's arrived at the school. We make any adjustments we may need to, and then don't revisit it at all throughout the entire year. So the way that the schools would advocate for positions were through an appeals process. It's very lengthy, it's cumbersome, and a lot of times if a position is appealed for, it may not get even a decision until 2-3 weeks out, just on the nature of the process. So we're moving to a new process where we're going to reevaluate the staffing at different points in the year. Once at reappointments for projections for next year, again at 8th day, similar to what we have been when the enrollments have been confirmed, and then again at survey 2, which is usually after winter break. So we're going to try and follow an FTE model, and we'll kind of get a little bit more into that in the later slides, why we're going to go that route. But at these times, and like I said, since we've always kind of had the appeals process, we're going to reevaluate how we go about actually letting the schools advocate for those positions, but those will be the certain times when we're going to be looking at enrollment changes.
If I may, Michael, let me interject here for a moment. Board members, please don't misconstrue the fact that there are still opportunities for schools to receive or retain existing staff. Those conditions will persist as we continue to expand academy programs. So for example, if we were to add a new academy program to a high school or to a middle school, that would come with additional staffing. They would receive that staffing enhancement for 3 years. This is the proposal that we've provided. And at the end of that third year, they must have the FTE to sustain the program. We're not talking about students moving from within the school into the academy. That's not the same thing. They must market and attract new students to that campus by virtual school transfers that would then make the program sustainable over time. It doesn't mean students within the same school cannot apply to the academy and attend. But at the end of 3 years, if the FTE has not grown to match the staffing allocation, then they will lose those staff. And historically, that's not been our case. We continue to put staff into schools and the entire time, our intent has been to grow academies, and yet we've actually had academies decline in enrollment, but retain large numbers of additional staff that other programs do not benefit from. Ms. Cunningham.
Correct me, so if I run the academy, and this year I have 12 students, let's say, I'm making up for 20 students, whatever. All right, and then I was able to attract, let's say, 5 more from internally. If the school is able to open up their enrollment for 5 more, does that accomplish the goal?
As long as the enrollment for the campus
The
grows.
campus grows.
Correct.
Okay,
But
because
the academy program cannot simply just take students from within the school campus.
I understand then nothing, okay, all right, thank you.
There are other opportunities for schools, for example, as I mentioned earlier today with Haines City. With Haines City's projected growth over the next 2 years, while they may on paper, due to their current enrollment, appear to lose administrative staff and/or a guidance counselor, we would retain them there for the next 2 years to support that school body and population that we know is going to grow into those portables until they can be reassigned into the new high school. It's a common sense approach to how do we staff schools. But to Mr. Bello's point, one of the problems that we had as a school district was we've had legacy programs and legacy enhancements to schools and with very little follow-through at the end. We also, in our previous school allocation model, if you were given a dean of discipline, the high school, for example, was allowed to convert that to an assistant principal's position, but then the school district had to pay that difference. There was no request, there was no appeal. It simply said, if I choose to do this, the school district will pay the difference. And that's what happens, is so we convert positions, and then 5 years later, we get a new administrator, and then lo and behold, they say, well, I didn't get the same staffing as everybody else. Yes, you did, but historically, other people have cashed in those positions and converted them into new roles. We're not going to keep funding that. So this is basically our ability to right-size and reevaluate every campus based off their actual FT enrollment, or specificity of needs. Clearly, EL students, special education students receive additional enhancements due to the specificity of the nature of their disability and/or supports that are required. So we exclude them traditionally from the conversation. But I didn't want anybody to walk away saying, there's no way for a school to get additional staff, because that's simply not the case. It's just we've taken away a very cumbersome appeal process that we had embedded previously that went through the regionals and went through everyone else. And quite frankly, I think at times puts schools at odds with each other because there's only so many available positions due to our budget. So, Ms. Wyatt. Oops, sorry. Ms. Miller.
That's from a previous.
Ms. Wyatt.
So as you talk about the FTE I understand the goal is to be able to have the FTE dollars to support additional units. What happens if we're looking at they're attracting them from XYZ Academy, now they're going to PDQ Academy? Will we be looking at where the enrollment is based on, because obviously if you have the students to support the academy, even if they came from within the high school, it may be a different academy that needs to lose units.
That is correct.
So is that process
Yes.
being built in? Okay, thank you.
is. It'll look systemically, it'll also look internally.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Sharpless?
Are we looking at weighted FTE specifically, or in our CTE programs? Since they're bringing in more dollars, are they in our staffing plan, or is that factored in at all?
No. We base it off of the base FTE allocation because there's no guarantee of the weighting. That's commensurate with student completion. For example, just like with AP, the teacher gets additional dollars in funding for their classroom if the students pass with a commensurate score. There's no way we cannot budget assuming everyone will pass. And so based off that, we go based off of the actual FTE allocation.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Allen?
So, the language on the previous appeals process, inefficient, cumbersome, lengthy, how many did we typically have? And
Every school would ask for something.
Yeah.
yeah. So there's no longer, so that window from reappointments, which happens in March, to the 8th day. So there's not an opportunity to appeal moving forward?
So there's two other opportunities that occur within both BudgetCom and Datacom, but those are not included in the appeals process. And you and I discussed those the other day.
Okay. All right. I think that's all I have.
And I'll clarify, Datacom is when schools will come and share their school's performance in their performance indicators. If a school says, and comes and says at that time that they believe, let's say a school has seen a 42% improvement in overall third grade reading proficiency from the baseline assessment to the mid-year assessment of FSA. And they believe that they could see further improvement if they could reduce their class size and get another reading interventionist. They'd have to provide data at that time in real time to justify the request. Moving forward, everything has to be justified based off actual data and information related to the program, related to student specificity of needs. And we are prioritizing where those dollars will go. Some requests are just that, a request. It's a wish list. Others are absolutely directly tied to student outcomes and student academic performance and/or behavioral needs, and so those would get prioritized over others.
Yeah, and I think in this one, and I appreciate the model. I was just curious where you may have a leader, school-based admin that could, based on their experience, see that, well, that projection is going to change, it's going to go up, right? So then they cut units, right? In a sense, our units are cut, and maybe they've lost, a great teacher in a sense. So then when that 8-day count comes, they're based on their experience, they knew that, if you get what I'm saying on this situation. So what I don't want us to do is leave admins in a place where they've lost teaching units and
I do.
and then trying to get those units back at the 8-day count.
Go ahead, Heather.
If I may, when we do our initial projections, we work with a large team of individuals, and that includes the regionals and our deputy superintendent of instruction. We look at several years prior. We also look at potential growth. We work with our student information system. We work with facilities. And then Mr. Bellows comes up with the projection. Once we have those, we go over them with the regionals who have been in contact with their principals, and he sets the allocations based on that. At the 8th-day count, that's our double check to make sure, did we have extra growth in one area or less growth in another? And the way the appeals process had worked before, it was an email system. So the principal would fill out an appeal, it would go to the principal, or go to the regional, then it would go to Mr. Bellows. He would pull a lot of data together and then distributed it to an appeals team, which is why it took so long, in order for us to have everything we needed. So now what we're going to do is we will pull the numbers based on enrollment, and we will do an initial projection, and then we'll pull that team together all at once to discuss what needs to be added, shifted, moved, to kind of clean it up and make sure that we're more efficient with it. And of course, if we have exponential growth mid-year, that's absolutely something we'll take a look at.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the energy on this. I'm curious, will we be able to see how many moving forward, like with this new process, At the 8-day count, how many lost units, and then how many had to bring units back? And do we have that from last year?
We do track that.
Yeah,
We track movement, yes, sir.
okay.
But we very seldom do we retract positions at the 8-day count and move them. And that's something our school district has not been comfortable doing. So you could have, let me give you a different example. You could have 3, again, we assumed based off my, personal opinion, personal reflection, that I'm going to need 3 kindergarten teachers. And each one of those kindergarten classrooms opens up and each have 10 students in them. We would absolutely, under normal circumstances, and most school districts would do this, at 8-day count, they would eliminate one of those positions and transfer it to another school that does require another position. We have not historically done that as a school district, and that's why we are largely overstaffed across the entirety of the district. Other times, the numbers don't make sense to consolidate and to move because the numbers are too tight. You don't really have the ability. You end up with very small class sizes across 3 or 4 sections of teachers, but there's not enough students there to stay under the class size cap, or we may feel for that school in particular, given their circumstances, we don't want to constrict those again. But at the same time, we're adding more positions elsewhere. So as a school district, we've got to put some controls in place. And with respect to our building administrators, I think the process that they've defined is a far more thorough process, which looks at historical data, looks at actual enrollment, and will allow us to allocate our resources best that way, in real time. And so, for example, Ms. Castle's department, she provides a lot of ancillary services to students through the LEAs. They're assigned to either an individual school or multiple schools, depending on their caseload. We have flexed up to 9 positions this year, knowing that the number of students we need to service will grow. But those individual positions have not been fully filled yet, and as the needs arise, we will fill the position and reassign them to a caseload of students. So it just makes more sense. But from a budgeting perspective, those 9 positions will be there, and if they're not utilized, they go back into the general budget at a later date to offset additional costs elsewhere.
Yeah, and I recognize the challenge. I mean, we talked about this yesterday, that, we are the second fastest growing in the state of Florida within the last 2 years, next to Miami-Dade. So 10,000 increase for them, 5,000 for us. So I definitely understand and see that. So I appreciate the new system here.
Ms. Fields?
I had a couple of questions. One of them, you made the statement that we are largely overstaffed. Can you elaborate on that, please?
I can. We do not have a significantly large number of our classroom sections that are at or exceeding class size. And so if you were to look across the system in its entirety, again, in individual classrooms, it may not seem, or individual schools, the numbers are not there. But when you look at 6th grade in its entirety, when you look at a grade level in its entirety, and the number of students that are being served by the number of staff, the average class size ratio makes it seem as if we could actually consolidate more positions. But because these students exist in pockets across the district in different schools, we can't consolidate those students. But we are overstaffed as a school district. And this is where zoning and other factors have to be addressed so that we can maximize our ROI. We are operating schools well under their overall capacity, and we have other schools that are well over their capacity. By redistributing those students, the average would change for those individuals, and we could consolidate staff in a much more meaningful way and reallocate them differently, which would allow us to better serve our students in the end. So that's the best explanation I can give you. I can give you some examples of schools. For example, we have one right down the street, Stevens, where the average class size is considerably smaller than it is in other commensurate elementary schools. Now, part of that is we have a comfort with that because we also know that we can get more one-on-one attention with those students in a smaller classroom environment. But it's not the same as another classroom. We could easily consolidate some of those grade level classrooms and free up a position. But we made a conscious decision this year not to do that, to better support those students and their needs, given their data and the history of the academic performance on that campus. So I hope that's making sense. So when you look at the total number of students by the total number of teachers, yes, we are overstaffed based off the ratio. But again, the way we're zoned and the way we support our campuses, some campuses are much closer to the class size cap, and some campuses are much lower than the class size cap.
It does make sense, and I was basically going to say that it all depends on the area
Yes, ma'am.
and what is necessary to benefit the students. So, thank you for that answer.
That's why we think this process works, is it allows us to address students in real time and their needs. And again, that's why I tried to clarify, and I'm sorry if it's become a belabored conversation here and just in slide 2. But I don't want people walking away saying schools cannot appeal for additional staff. They can. However, there's a different process in place now, and it's actually going to be better streamlined, and it'll be done much earlier in the school year versus much later. To your point, Dr. Allen, none of us want to wait till 8-day count. If we're watching numbers climb and we know we're going to need an additional kindergarten section, that's typically where we see a lot of change. We want to do that earlier, because the longer we allow students to sit in that classroom, the more disruptive it becomes for the families. If I get complaints, and you would not think that you get complaints about adding staff to a school, but you do, because my child has been with that teacher now for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, depending on the hiring cycle and how long it takes us to add a teacher to a campus. And now I have to take 2 classrooms that are oversized and somehow pick a group of students out of those classrooms to move into a new teacher's classroom. We always ask for volunteers. You do not get the number that you need. And then you start asking students to move, and parents, rightfully so, call and email and say, why does my child have to move? Why can't somebody else's child move? But somebody has to move. And over time, it typically resolves itself. Our principals do a very good job, actually, of managing this process. But it does become a disruption for our families. So the sooner we can recognize that a school is on a trajectory where they're going to exceed their class size and we need to pop, I call it popping a section, right? They qualify for an extra unit. We want to make that happen as quickly as we can. So it's the least disruptive transition for everyone. And I have Ms. Miller. Sorry, ma'am.
I'm changing it a little bit, but it has to do with this. So, and I know this has to do with size. What's a half of media specialist?
So schools have the opportunity to either fund the rest of a media specialist, so a full library media specialist position with Title I funds, or it will turn to a media para. But we allocate 0.5, so they have that flexibility.
Do schools have, do principals have negotiating power and discretionary units? Because some have 0, but a couple of these schools, from their academics side, if I was the principal, I would want a discretionary unit to push in support when needed.
So the allocation of a discretionary is
Right.
based on enrollment.
So if you have a lower enrolled school, but they're high need, how do we fill that support?
It'll have to be on a case-by-case basis. But if they don't meet the need for a discretionary, or if they don't meet the enrollment threshold for a discretionary unit, then they wouldn't be allocated a discretionary unit.
But we do have lower enrolled schools with high levels of need. Superintendent?
Those are also addressed through Title I. They're also addressed through DA. So if that school is a DA school, there are required additional supports and interventions that have to be provided. So they do get those enhancements by virtue of that. They also get additional allocation of Title I funds.
Okay, so I'm hoping that's where we can make it up, because if I was a principal trying to avoid DA, I would not want to not have a discretionary unit. But that answers my question. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting topic, and I think it's worth exploring more, quite frankly. A discretionary unit is not going to have the impact that many of us believe it's going to have, because the sheer number of students who require additional intervention and or supports is going to be incredibly large. So you have to look at students and differentiate them based off of where their actual skill set needs are and how frequent that intervention has to be provided. So a discretionary unit is we allocate units based off academic performance needs, not necessarily just by, like, we provide a standard through enrollment, but then those schools, to your point, that are academically fragile receive additional enhancements through other means. For example, Ms. Barnes and her team do an amazing job of evaluating the school's performance and adding coaches, interventionists, and other positions to make sure that they have the actual number of resources they need to be impactful. But if you have a school of 600 kids and you have one reading interventionist, they're just not going to get the support and intervention that they deserve on a daily basis or a regular basis to make a difference.
Can they use discretionary units to hire, like we used to do, I don't know what we called them, the permanent substitute, instead of pulling support teachers or inclusion teachers to cover classrooms, where we had the permanent sub at the school? Is that a discretionary unit, or can that be funded some other place? You know what I'm saying?
So the only thing that we use discretionary units for are interventionists, coaches, guidance counselors, and then deans. So the schools should have their own sub-budget.
The substitute budget it's been maintained district-wide for several years. Prior to my arrival here, we used to actually charge the schools whenever they had a substitute. So now we, using Kelly Services, have a district-wide management of that. There are certain schools, we have a pilot sub that they
That's what we call them,
requested,
pilot subs.
which is your at-school. We have a process for that. It's, we go through an evaluation to look at how many absences they've had, how many absences they typically run, the ability to fill that position through Kelly, and if it's feasible, we can add that position to mitigate the situation.
Do we add that, or is it a employee through Kelly that serves as a pilot sub, or
It's one of our employees.
can you send me what that requirement is? Because I'm interested, because I think schools because of my background, I hear way too many calls of, these kids got no inclusion hours because I've got to cover other classrooms. And I don't know that our schools are asking for pilot subs. Do you know what I mean?
It's not something that we've done prevalently
Right.
across the district. It was done more so in the past.
I'd be interesting getting with ESE to find out how many inclusion hours in some of our schools that we're not getting based on support needed for other rooms, because that might define the need for the pilot sub. Thank you.
You're good, Mr. Bellows.
Okay. So the next one is a shift from differentiating the allocations between elementary, middle, and high to more of a singularity model. I've coined it. So whereas one elementary school who's at 1,000 might not ever get another assistant principal just based on the old staffing plan, you have a high school that's at 1,000 that might get 3. So we've reallocated the units based on enrollment alone instead of differentiating between elementary, middle, and high. And then the thresholds are there on the slide. So the next one, assistant principal 2s. So they've been removed from the staffing plan and they'll no longer be allocated to the schools. This mostly impacts middle schools because those were directly allocated, and then, as Mr. Hyde mentioned, deans were typically allowed to convert to an AP2, but they will no longer be applicable for that situation.
Mr. Bellows, please explain where they're going and why.
So we are reallocating the admin staff to the elementary schools because historically the elementary schools never got an additional AP despite their enrollment. So you have schools that are over, like I said, 1,000 that only had 1 AP. So now we're redistributing those units throughout the entire district to make it more equitable among all of the different schools.
But why the AP2s?
So the AP2s did not have any authority to do any evaluations. So they were essentially still a dean and operating in the dean capacity, so they couldn't operate as an assistant principal with specifically evaluations. So by eliminating the AP2s and in essence elevating them to an AP1, they now have that AP status to be able to conduct those evaluations and assist in the actual admin at the school. Secretarial units, those will be different, but there's no change to the allocation. We're just identifying what their responsibilities are. So every single secretary either was a principal secretary or a school-based secretary, and then we identified the different months. We're changing them now so they will have a specific job description for a finance secretary of 11 months, a registrar for 12 months, which was historically our TO, terminal operators, and then we also have the school-based 10-month secretaries. So for our specialized programs, we've removed the programmatic staffing. So what that means is the staffing plan identified that regardless of your enrollment at a specialized, so your IBs, your Cambridges, your CFAAs, your Summerlin, regardless of what your enrollment is, you would get this number of units, this number of APs, this number of teachers, but it didn't matter what their enrollment is. So we've eliminated that, and we're saying each of them will automatically get a head of program or the head of school for IB or a commandant for Summerlin. They'll get a school-based 10-month secretary, and then that says 2, it should be 1. 1 clinic LPN if the campus is over 1 mile from the home school for situations like your CFAA. Enrollments of the programs in conjunction with the home school will determine the units earned. So for example, you're going to combine your school A and then your school A IB. And if that earns you 4 counselors, then 4 counselors will be allocated to the school, and then this principal will have the flexibility to say, I want 2 of you to work half-time for school A, and then the other half for school A IB. Or they could say 1 full counselor will go to school A, or school A IB, and then the rest of you will be school A, just the general population. So the principals will then have that flexibility to use whatever allocation is earned through the combined enrollment.
So who is the ultimate decision in that? According to this, it would be the principal.
The principal.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Because, Ms. Cunningham, they're using their existing allocation.
I got it. Just want to be clear, as people listening.
So this slide just basically shows that we're no longer automatically allocating these units to these programs. These are the ones that were only listed in the staffing plan. So if one was left out, it just means it was not specified, which is another reason why we're going through this process and making everything equal and equitable. Just because it doesn't say that they're not going to be automatically allocated a counselor does not mean they won't be allocated one. It's just going to be based on enrollment for the entire school. So where we see Bartow IB would have automatically, regardless of enrollment, been given 1 AP 11-month, a 10-month secretary, a resource specialist, or a guidance counselor, an 11-month secretary, and then a certain amount of units, even if they only had 100 students. So now we're changing that to say whatever your enrollment is that you generate, you're going to get your head of program or your head of school and your, that should actually say a 10-month secretary, but a secretary, 10-month secretary, and then whatever you generate moving forward with your enrollment.
Unless the administration chose to flex a position over to provide additional supports.
Correct.
Ms. Wyatt.
So if a school has multiple of those programs, is there a minimum enrollment for each program to have the head of school position?
So right now, the head of school program has already been capped. So there's 1 per high school at this time.
Okay,
With the
except for
exception of
Bartow.
Bartow, who,
Main City.
because of the conversation we had with the board, we landed at a head of school or head of program for Bartow IB, and because of Summerlin Academy, they retained a commandant. So it is different. And
But they
especially-
also have a head of program.
Correct. They have a separate head of program that oversees all other academies and career tech ed programs.
And so does Haines City has the same setup with a head.
I don't recall Haines Cities. Mr. Bellows is
Yes.
saying.
So every high school should have a
So
head.
the IBs still have a head of school and a head of program, but Cambridge just get a head of program.
That's not my recollection at all.
Okay,
Mr. Bellows?
because that's what the sheets are saying.
Yes, so every high school will get a head of program for their academies regardless of whether they have an IB, a Cambridge, or a CFAA. Then the additional program of the CFAA or the IB, regardless of what campus it is at, will also get a head of program to oversee that program.
So these then may not be completely accurate, is what I'm,
No, let me rephrase. These are accurate. This is specifically for the program. So for Winter Haven, Cambridge, they will receive a head of program and a 10-month secretary.
right.
They also receive, which is not reflected here because we're not talking, this is only for Cambridge. As a school, they also receive that 11-month AP who oversees all other academy programs.
Okay.
So they still get that programmatic enhancement that the board agreed to last year.
Okay, but there, it's listed as an AP for some schools and a head of program for other schools?
At a program we reserved for Cambridge, for IB, and for Summerlin. Those were the three programs that the board agreed because we wanted a different title.
Right. I just, when you look at the spreadsheets, it says head of school or head of program for, like Bartows has a head of school for IB, they have a head of program and a commandant.
That could have been an error on our part. Head of
Main
program
cities.
is at CFAA, head of school should be at Winter Haven for Cambridge, if I recall
Okay.
correctly.
For the IBs, we use head of school, and then head of program would be for all the other programs listed, is how we have it. We can change it.
Correct.
We can change it, for consistency, it should be
Correct,
changed to
yeah.
head of program.
Okay,
Head of school.
but what I'm saying is that the spreadsheets that we received show that the IBs have a head of school for their IB program and a head of programs for their academies. Okay, so these are not
I
accurate.
spoke too soon. They do, but so does Winter Haven.
Okay, because that's not reflected in there for the Winter Havens. It shows they only have a head of one head of program, which would be their IB.
So the spreadsheets that you have don't consider the IB programs. So it's only looking at the
They
head
don't
of
consider
program is
Cambridge.
what's on their academy.
They only consider IB. Okay.
So your specialized programs on the actual Excel sheet, because we're limited with our Excel sheet, it's not gonna reflect the two that you get for IB also.
So it does say head of school IB and has
Does it?
that reflected.
On the-
Yeah,
on
but
the
it
Excel
doesn't for
sheet?
Cambridge, correct.
Okay,
So that's why I
We'll
was
make the
asking.
correction.
then we'll make the corrections. I didn't realize that I had added that on there for IB.
I'm thrilled that it's just a technical error.
Yes, it's
Don't
just a
worry.
technical error. There was a lot going on.
We spent a lot of time adhering
Thank you.
to the directions of the board. You know, the AP2s, it's really important for us to elevate them and move them to the AP1, because otherwise, really, when you think about it, if they can't evaluate staff, they are exactly the same as a dean. There is no difference between the two of them, because a lot of your AP2s are still they are not doing necessarily, they're doing some academics, but they're doing a lot of discipline as well. So elevating them to the AP1, we actually get a better, I would say, a better pipeline for future leadership as well, because now they're having to evaluate instruction, provide feedback, learn how to coach others, and mentor, which is a skill set that many of them otherwise would not be able to develop, because they're not put in that position where they could.
Thank you.
Okay, so those are the workups, as we discussed a little bit. Just to note, again, several factors may contribute to some discrepancies you might see. So funding, appeal submissions, decisions, enrollment changes, the specialized programs, all of those, even though it says what they were allocated in school year 23, which is what we're currently in, it may not be accurate. It's just what the intended allocation would be with the current staffing plan, and then shows the changes of what it would look like if we were to follow exactly with the next staffing plan. So it's just to show the differentiation between the allocations. So the next piece of this is a site-based model. So it's a pilot program that we're using for 6 of our schools. And it's to shift from the district way of us telling them, here's what your enrollment is, this is what you're going to get, to now we're saying, here's how much FTE you've generated, this is how much money you've generated, you're going to tell us what you want. So it's giving the schools the opportunity the principals, to be their own CEO of their own campus. So it gives them the flexibility. So all of the changes that we've talked about up to this point are kind of helping pave the way for everyone to eventually end up at the site-based model. So historically, we've been district-based, which is where we tell them, you have 1,000 students, so you're going to get this, 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 and this, based on the staffing plan. But we're going to shift to the site-based, which is going to be the funding that's actually generated through your FTE. So there are a few differences. Obviously, the flexibility at the school level to allocate the units based on the individual needs at the school. Since we're so large, we recognize that the staffing plan may not work for one school like it does for another school. So this will help alleviate that. It'll help the schools actually see their available budget and how much they're generating. So it gives us a lot more transparency. It will follow the same timelines as the staffing model currently, so we'll true up the funds essentially at Survey 2, similar to how we would verify the enrollment with the current staffing plan, but it's looking at actual FTE instead. So that's one of the main things is going to be FTE versus our enrollment. So as most of you know, schools funding is generated by FTE. They're weighted differently, so a gen ed student receives a weight of 1.126 for Polk County, which equates to approximately $4,400 per student. If you have a matrix level 5 student, they receive a weight of 5.4, which equates to approximately $21,000 per student. So those variances in those FTE generations will actually be visible and usable at the school level with the new site-based model, and it'll be up to the discretion of the principal. So another example why the shift from enrollment to FTE is prevalent, because we have in some instances where a student may be enrolled at 2 different campuses. Enrollment would count that as 2, so 1 at one school and 1 at the other, so it's 1 full student where they may only be at the school half-time. So your FTE would count it as 0.5, whereas enrollment would count it as 1, so it would be a lot more proficient in being able to determine the needs of the school based on the actual FTE at that school.
Ms. Miller?
I have a question before you get too far away from it.
Sure.
This is something I think is very positive for schools who complain that there's just cookie cutter that they don't fit into. Here's my concern. You just said a 255 matrix gets $21,000 a student. In my years of community advocacy, I could pull site-based budgets where that money did not go to that student. And so I know it goes to the whole, this is a big shift to what we were doing. I just want to make sure there's oversight for the dollars flowing into a school, that they are used not only to fill areas of testing needs, but to meet the needs of the diverse population that those principals have. And I don't know that we've always, and we may have, because I know we've changed how we train and give support. We haven't always trained principals in that. And so some of them struggle with how to use those funds to differentiate in population. So my question is, these are site-based budgets, or site-based selections. Who is the regionals oversight? Who is the oversight of this?
It will be the regionals to assist the schools, but we have specific instruction for the schools to communicate with each necessary department. So the very first, we'll get into it, but the very first slide on the actual Excel spreadsheet that they're going to be using to determine their allocations is ESE, and it instructs them they must meet with their either ESE senior manager or the ESE department to determine what those needs at that campus really are.
Because it looks different everywhere.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they cannot cash in certain positions. I want to make sure we're clear on this. While principals, administrators will have some flexibility with their overall staffing allocation, there will be expectations that are set that, for example, there's a minimum number of ELA teachers they have to hire, a minimum number of math teachers, a minimum number of EL teachers. And so they'll go through that spreadsheet, and then there'll be additional dollars that are provided to them that they could then, or positions that they may be able to flex. And, and Ms. Miller raises a very good point. Sometimes we see that number for the weighted FTE for a student, and a school says, well, I get every one of those dollars. You don't. Because in many instances, we provide itinerant services and supports for those students that the district has to then subsequently pull some of those dollars to offset those operating costs. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, behavioral interventionists, all of those nurses become quite crucial for us to make sure that we can allocate those funds adequately to provide all the services that student needs. So a school would not simply say, oh, wow, I got $21,000 for Fred. That's not how it works. They get a portion of that based off what the district's operating costs are for some of the positions that support him or her.
Overall, I think this is a great change and will be helpful, because too many times we hand them a cookie cutter template and it doesn't work for them. My concern is that need has been consistent of the application of the dollars. So thank you for clarifying who's responsible for that.
Ms. Cunningham?
Thank you. I can't tell you how many years I have been asked and requested that we get to this point. For those of our educators out there that are principals and our leaders, they say, hey, you entrust me, you give me the building, you give me the students, you give me the resources, but my hands are tied how I allocate those resources, because every school is different, every campus is different, every need is different based on the students. So I just want to say thank you. This is so refreshing. When I was reading through this last night, I just thought that was amazing, and I'm going to ask as we move on how you chose those 6 schools as pilots, because I thought that was interesting too. They're all over the board, so to speak, but I think it's great. I think if we hire individuals to be our principal leaders in our schools, you know, it's kind of like a mini CEO of their company, and they need to be given the resources and the ability to allocate those based on their individual needs and their student population. So I just want to say this is awesome. I understand it's going to be piloted, right, for this coming year. And then as we go through, you know, and learn what worked and what didn't, then perhaps, are we looking to take this system-wide? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, man, so awesome. So awesome. Thank you, sir. Just wanted to commend everybody. Whose idea? Who came up with this? I've been saying that for years. So whoever came up with it, it's amazing.
It has been an effort of love
Okay.
for many of us.
Okay.
Mr. Green and I were very fortunate to be in a school district when we were administrators that did this.
That did this, so you
And
understood.
so we had a great deal of flexibility, and being in a Title I setting, you know, I had extra dollars. I had supplemental academic instruction, and I had other funds, I had title dollars. So I was able, once I filled all of my required positions.
Yes, sir.
I was able to get quite creative with how I wanted to best address the intervention strategies on my campus. Some monies were spent on tutoring, some monies were spent elsewhere. We did some things with substitutes. For example, every teacher, you know, once a month, the entire department would get half a day off to come in and co-plan with their coach. And we would flex the subs throughout the day, and it just took a lot of coordination, but the dollars had to come from somewhere. And they, you know, they were really appreciative of that because they felt like they were being treated as professionals. They got extra planning time, a half a day of planning. So I think a lot of us come back with that mindset and that perspective of how do we empower our building administrators? And this helps us get away from the double ask, right? I get an allocation, now I feel like I have to allocate, feel like I have to develop a compelling argument. So now we're giving you flexibility within your budget to say, okay, how do you best want to approach and problem solve? With the understanding that you're going to be, ultimately, you're responsible. You know, the decisions you make, you live or die by. But that's why the regionals, and that's why and to Michael's point, Mr. Bello's point, excuse me, they'll meet with every single department that signs off. So they'll meet with special education, they'll meet with ELL, they'll meet with everyone, career tech ed and academies. And that way, everyone has their eyes on it and can support them during this initial transition period so that we don't make mistakes that are going to cost us in the long run.
I just want to commend you, Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Green for just doing a tremendous job, because I can tell you how many years I understand. And, I mean, but leadership starts at the top.
I think they thought we were crazy when we first started talking.
Probably.
Mr. Bellows has had to reinvent the wheel, that's for sure.
Well, it's going to be appreciating. You wait till you start hearing information come in from your principal leaders out there, because this is something that I know I've personally been asked for at least 10, if not more years. So kudos to everybody involved. It's going to be so well received. So thank you for being innovative and looking outside the box. So we appreciate it.
Ms. Fields.
I had a similar question to Ms. Cunningham. I wanted to know whose idea this was, and you've answered that. And then my other question is, leadership of the schools, have they been involved in it at all, or how have you guys brought them to the table?
Yes, ma'am, this has been an ongoing conversation with our site-based administrators. There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. They knew that we were going to pilot it and slowly roll it out. I think many of them are waiting anxiously because, you know, with anything new, there's going to be something that they find that's really enjoyable, and then other moments of frustration, like, why did I ask for this? I'm taking on more responsibilities. But I would Mr. Bellows and Ms. Jenkins, do you want to highlight, I mean, we've talked about it at principals meetings, we've talked about it in other areas. We selected a pilot program, ASBA's aware of it, so I would say we've done a pretty good job communicating, conveying it to them. And if it were not a sincere interest on behalf of many of our schools, as you know, many of them are kind of requested this type of flexibility, then we may have gone in a different direction. But this is something they're excited about, and I feel very strongly that this empowers them as leaders on their campuses, because they're not cookie cutter. And while the cookie cutter approach is how do we give them positions, internally they then need to problem solve and figure out how to best place those positions to elicit an outcome or an expectation for students. So, but Mr. Bellows and Ms. Jenkins, is there anything else you'd like to add as far as other information we've shared with building principals? And
Yes, so we've actually provided training to them on how to work the spreadsheet, and they've done their own calculations with a sample school with sample FTEs. So they've been through the process essentially for a sample school, and they've had the opportunity to play around with the spreadsheet and see what their allocations might look like if they had that exact population. So it seems like it was, like he said, well received and exciting for them.
Mr. Sharpless.
Thank you, Superintendent. I first got to say I'm excited about this model. I think it's great. What I come to think when I think about it, I wonder the evaluation component. I know we're piloting this in 6 different schools. What determines if this is a successful pilot, and then having this go district-wide? How do we evaluate principals based on this staffing model? Making good decisions and bad decisions, right? Just like you would in a business. Wondering if you had any answers to this.
If they're going to be allowed to make bad decisions?
Well, no, how you evaluate whether this pilot program staffing model is successful.
So I think it's
To roll it out.
combination of things. I think, can we adequately ensure that students can receive the instruction that they deserve? Can we ensure that class sizes are appropriate? Can we ensure that school staff feel like they have the resources they need to be competitive? We'll get feedback from our building administrators. I'm sure we'll get feedback from PEA and from ASME and from other groups about this based off what their impressions are as well. But at the end of the day, it's outcome. I think at the end of the day, if we're going to empower people and say, listen, we're going to let you, not only pick your players, but we're going to let you field your team, and we're going to be there throughout the whole thing. I assure you, there will be no mistakes. Meaning there will not be an opportunity for a school to say, we're just not, and I'm going to pick on Ms. Miller for a moment. A school will not be able to say, we're not going to do special education services this year. We're just going to focus on every kid as if they're being mainstreamed. And we'll cash in all those extra positions and we'll add this, this, and this. That can't happen. There are safeguards in place that prevent that. So I think from an outcome perspective, it's the regionals evaluating from the get-go. It's every single department or associate superintendent reviewing those budgets, critically, providing coaching feedback to staff, to our administrators, asking the question, why do you want to do it this way? Help me understand, because that might be just a breakdown and understanding about how to better support and serve those students. And, so I think it's going to take us 2 or 3 years. The pilot schools are exceptional schools, as you can see. They have exceptional leaders who have shown a willingness and an interest in doing this and being on the front edge. So I think it's just going to take feedback from them and from others to really determine whether or not it's ultimately been successful. And then if we see an overall reduction in the requests for extra positions, that will be an indication of success as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Ms. Miller.
Yeah, I just want to follow up that I don't think principals go out saying they're not going to meet the needs of students, but the way our system is created is they are rewarded if certain students make certain achievements. And in the past, we've had something very similar. And I'm talking probably 15 plus years ago. And I think what we were missing was the site-based support and follow-up through the regionals. Because people are only doing what they know, and I don't know that we were ever good at explaining federal law to some of our principals. And so I think I have great hopes for this, but for someone who lived through the days where it wasn't working as well, I am a little shy of it. So I can't wait for you to show me how successful this program will be.
You're clear, sir.
So the pilot schools are these listed. Mr. Hyde has answered a bit of why we picked these schools, but we did rely a lot on the regionals and deputy superintendent when these selections were made. So those are some of the reasons why these schools. And obviously we have a wide range, high school, a couple middle schools, and then obviously your elementary schools. So the next few slides, as with everything that we've talked about, it's all in the works, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And today I was working on how to make it better, and we're still working on looking at adding federal units because we're only really discussing local units in this current model. So we're still developing it. So as we go through this, it's really more to show what it looks like and what the flow will be and what it will appear to as it will appear for the principals. So the very first sheet that they will get is an Excel sheet that shows pretty much the instructions for how they're going to fill it out, everything we've talked about, the times that we're going to make our adjustments, the expectation that they maintain good budgets, and then hold back funds, all the intricate details, and obviously this will grow as we go through them, and then the process of how to actually go through these slides. So each one of these slides will be sequential order. So the next slide that we go to will be the first sheet that they'll see, that they'll be able to review their information and then make their allocations. So this is the first tab. Like I said, ESE would be the first tab that they have to work with. So this is probably the slide that has the most going on. This is a sample, an example of a school. It's not one that was actually on the list. It's just arbitrary numbers. So we have the FTE that is generated. It's a middle school, so you have 6 through 8 students. The additional funding for each of those ESE at the top, it shows your full district budget, which is the total budget less purchase positions to this point, and then your remaining budget after you've made your selection. You have your actual FTE counts and your enrollments on the right-hand side at the top. And then at the bottom is where they're going to actually make their allocation selections. The left white column next to the title of the position will show you what our recommendation is based on staffing plan. They can choose to follow it. They can choose not to follow it. It's totally up to the school. But we give them a recommendation based on what student population we can see that's actually in the system. So the school will make their selection in the goldenrod, yellowish cells. Once they make their selection, it will total up the cost of their positions, and it will show them how much money those positions cost them, and then they can move on. So they'll move on to the next tab, which is their ESOL tab. It'll calculate out their total FTE. It will tell them any additional funding. So ESOL gets a certain percentage extra, which will incorporate into their additional ESOL funding. It'll project to them approximately how many teaching units they'll need. It'll show them their total budget. At the bottom, it's the same concept. You have your positions, your recommended units, which is based on the staffing plan again, and then their selections, and then it will show them the cost. This will be their instructional tab. It'll be the next tab. So it tells them at the top left their total FTE at their school. On the right-hand side, it shows them the breakdown of those grade levels. We give them a target number to shoot for at the top left, which is the total number of units that they would need to service these students based on class size. And then they'll be able to make their selections. For you have your core units, K through 5. You've got math, science, English, language, arts, social studies, elementary school, art, music, PE, and so on and so forth. If a non-core class is not listed on here that they want to select, they can obviously indicate other and then type out whichever subject or class they want to potentially add, and then it'll have to go through the appropriate approval process, obviously, if it's adding a new program per se. But they have their option to select whichever position they would want to staff. Next will be administration. Obviously, every school has to have a principal, so that's not really negotiable. And then they'll have their option to pick. Here's our recommendation at the top, and then the number of units that they want. It will total the amount and then tell them the budget that they have left over. Same thing for instructional support. So your counselors, your media specialists, your testing coordinators, your academic interventionists, and your coaches. We give you a recommendation based on the staffing plan. You're able to enter in what you would like, and then shows you your remaining budget. Same thing for your paraeducators. And then you have miscellaneous costs. So obviously you have a substitute budget, you have a custodial budget, your utilities, your phones, an operating budget. We've allowed them to adjust their operating budget. The intent is really to add to their operating budget, but the option is there to adjust that cost. And then a suggested holdback. So we're going to suggest that the schools hold back a certain amount of funds in the event that they gain FTE and need more teachers, or they lose FTE and they have to get rid of some of those funds and return those funds back. So,
I think this, I would ask one question on slide, either we put it in instructional support or we could include it in that last tab on slide 23 for the teachers, to give them the choice of a sub. I don't see that listed. So if there's a way for us to, as we continue to revise and edit these, add that full-time sub as an option for them. Because what I want to avoid is a school saying, well, I know I can get a full-time sub that's not listed here, so I'm going to squeeze it under, I'll make it an academic coach and I'll just use it as a full-time sub. No, let's classify it the right way so we know exactly what they're spending their dollars on, so.
We can have that.
Ms. Wyatt?
Thank you. And I apologize if I missed this, but when you're submitting the numbers, it's based on an average for what one unit costs or one teacher costs, or is it based on who's in your system?
For the cost of each position, it's an
Right.
equivalency. So
Okay.
we use an average of every single teaching position, and whatever that equivalency comes out to is what we use as the estimated cost.
Okay.
Same for every other position.
So what happens when we have a school that has all very, 30, 40 years in the profession that obviously are at the higher end of the pay scale? I just want to make sure that we're not penalizing schools for being able to maintain teachers for 20, 30 plus years, but also that we're not hurting their budget that way either.
Go ahead, sir.
So it's still being worked out. The intent is that if the school has a higher level teacher, then the teacher will come out of that budget. So the schools are going to have to account for those. There are certain trainings that they're going to go through that, educate them on how to best accommodate those types of situations. But it will have to be accounted for in the budget.
Okay.
Most of the accounting for will occur on our end. Because to your point, schools that have veteran staff that may qualify, or schools that have staff, it doesn't have to necessarily be a veteran staff, but who have different degree attainment and they're paid commensurately different. It typically comes out in the wash, because every year we onboard about 1,000 new teachers, which drops the overall average. So a lot of the accounting will happen behind the scenes, but by no means will a school level's allocation be impacted based off of, okay, you have too many veteran teachers, so we're not gonna give you that money. They'll get their actual allocation in that regard. So this is, like he said, it's still a template that's being finalized. But for comfort reasons and for training purposes, we didn't want to overly complicate the process. But you have our assurance that, yes, ma'am, and we will provide that information to you so you know if there's any overages.
Thank you. And you look at a lot of our higher performing schools and they have maybe 4 vacancies a year, and it's because somebody turned 80 and retired and
Correct.
somebody went on maternity. It's just, you don't see very many vacancies at those schools. So I want to make sure we're not penalizing them either.
No, ma'am.
So the last tab that they'll have is just a summary view and overview. We've selected in the sample just exactly what the recommendation would be, so there is no change to the costs. So everything balances out. But if there was a different cost, if they decided they wanted to purchase an 11-month AP as opposed to a 12-month AP, then you would see a savings on that line and then a cost on the other line, and then it would show you the ultimate cost or savings on the subtotal for the administrative lines. So that's the thought process behind this summary page. And then it's also at the top of that page, it gives you a summary of the summary of each subtotal and how it accounts for your total budget for the school. And that's it.
They see schools when they cash in a position is using that to pay for additional duty supplements. An extra period supplement, I should say, not the additional duty supplement. So there are a lot of teachers who are willing to forfeit their planning period to pick up an extra class section. That is far cheaper in the overall scheme. You can buy more sections or units or sections of class time by breaking out a salary versus paying an individual because of the way their planning periods and everything else works out. Monetarily, it works out very different. So that's the way we'll work with our administrators to make sure we're maximizing our efficiencies that way. And I think you'll be very pleased with the end result. Ms. Fields, I saw your hand go up. Let me turn your mic on. I apologize, ma'am. Go ahead, Ms. Fields.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment. This is a big shift, and it's going to take a lot of work and adjustment on everybody's part. And I just want to make sure that it's done with fidelity and with grace. And I really want to emphasize grace, because again, it's a shift. And we're gonna have some things that work well and some things that don't. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are doing it to the best of our ability, which I'm sure that we will. And again, keeping the leadership in mind that it's going to be an adjustment for them, an adjustment even for their team. So I just want to make sure that that is stated.
Point well taken, and I think that's one of the reasons we started with a pilot group. They then will become mentors to others, and so each year, as subsequently you see more and more individuals coming on board, I think that'll be a really good process for us that will ensure just that. We will be there as a safety net, not a critical partner, but as a safety net to make sure mistakes are not made that otherwise would impair our ability to appropriately serve our students and our schools. So I think, to your point, yes, ma'am, hear you loud and clear, and we will be sure to adequately support our staff and make them feel good about the process that we're doing, because this is really about them. This is about empowering our school-based administrators. And I think many of them have expressed sincere gratitude for this. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, sir. I don't see any other questions. You're out of the hot seat. Unless, Dr. Allen, I heard you home. Okay. All right. I thought I heard it. Next is Brian Warren. He's going to be discussing the request for specialized student services and staffing update. This is for a request for a new secretary too for 12-month for ESP. Clearly, he's being joined by Mr. Brett Butler.
Mr. Brett Butler will be joining me. This was a piece we wanted to bring forward to you as a carryover relative to a piece that we had previously brought to you to make sure you're aware of a position that Mr. Butler needs in his office relative to some other new staff that was brought on in a previous approval. And so I'm going to let him explain its position, its use, and how it will benefit his staff.
Good afternoon. How are you all today? The position is a Secretary 2 position for our community liaisons for working on our truancy. I believe you all received an update from Mr. Hyde last Friday with some of the numbers, some exciting numbers, I think, that we're accomplishing. And the outgoing volume is there. Well, what isn't being shown is the incoming volume from parents calling, saying, please, my child is going to come to school. Can you please tell them not to come by tomorrow? We're going to come to school. So that other side of the house, they're calling our office, that volume is continuing to go up. The paperwork, the letters that are going home, the assisting the schools in the letters is all part of that duty. Any questions? And this is all coming out of grant funds from last year. We just were waiting on the state to finally give us the green light for approval.
Mr. Butler, I do not see any questions at this time. However, if a board member contacts me or you afterwards, please make sure you respond.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Warren. And last but certainly not least, as far as presentations today, we will bring up Carol Matthews for her second tour today. And she will be providing an update on revised internal audit for charter.
Good afternoon. This is just a clerical or administrative task for the internal audit charter to be updated to reflect current changes in statute. So that is what we have here. And then actually, I have it here for information and then was going to bring it back at the February 28th board meeting for you to actually approve. So I don't know if there's any questions.
I am looking. I do not see any as of yet. Any questions, concerns, or comments? Not seeing any. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This afternoon. Thank you, board members. Thank you, Madam Chair. A lengthy day today, great conversations. I appreciate your time today, and I will turn it over to our chair.
Thank you, Superintendent Hyde. I will now open the floor for any board member comments, liaison updates for your committees. I think, Sharpless, did you click this for, okay. That was for me. All right, Mr. Sharpless.
Okay. I just want to say I've enjoyed being on the Polk Vision Operating Board so far. I'm in the Infrastructure Working Group. So if anyone has any ideas or anything related to the infrastructure of our county, make sure to let me know. Also, so when I first signed up to do the Value Adjustment Board, I was under the assumption that that was, because in the previous, it was a morning meeting. And now it's been moved to a lunchtime meeting, and that changes my availability. So I believe the correct thing to do is to bring that back and for you guys to appoint someone different than me. And just because I'm not going to be available and I don't think it's fair. But that was my understanding at the time. So I do have something else, but that I would like to just request on the record. If we could have a workshop at some point on our interlocal agreement, because I don't fully understand it. I'm trying, I'm reading it, but I think having our staff come forward and actually explain what the interlocal agreement is, that would help, because I'm getting some comments from citizens just asking us if we're following that. And again, I don't have expertise in that, so I don't feel comfortable answering that. So if we could have just a workshop on our interlocal agreement.
Which interlocal agreement?
The concurrency one. Yeah.
So Ms. Wyatt has requested that we bring somebody in to speak to you as it relates to concurrency. There'll be a presentation regarding concurrency in the near future.
That would be great.
Yes, we are compliant. And we have been answering questions from those stakeholders consistently as they're submitted. But we'll try and bring in, the Department of Education used to have someone, and they used to have a department that would support this, that no longer exists. So we're having to go out to other school districts and really having to rely more heavily on their staff. Mr. Bridges, is assisting with this, trying to find attorneys who might be able to speak to us, but we're also reaching out to facilities directors who have been in their positions for a longer period of time. There are some who are held in very high regard across the state who might be willing to come over and speak to the board and host a workshop. It would be a special workshop on that topic in and of itself.
Thank you. I would like just for the public to be more educated on it, and me myself as a board member, I feel like I should be more educated on it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharpless. And my request with that too was that we have someone that can explain not just what we're doing, but what the statute allows. Because I think there may be some things in statute that we could look at doing as well, is my understanding. As far as the Value Adjustment Board, that actually is on my list. Mr. Sharpless is unable to attend, and I believe Ms. Cunningham was the alternate and is also unable to attend. I went ahead and put it on my calendar just so we would know somebody is available. But there are 2 meetings. The first one is at 11:30 on March 31st, which is a Friday. That is an appointment that we have to vote on, so we'll need to bring it back to the February 28th meeting. But if anyone is interested in just jumping to serve on that committee, I'm happy to nominate you for appointment if anyone's interested, because we'll need both a nominee and an alternate, I believe is.
That's what,
Are those
Okay.
meetings always on a Friday?
yes.
They all are,
They've been, yeah. But
Okay.
I didn't, once again,
sorry,
let me turn me on.
you're on now.
I'm on? Okay, so I have the same issue as Mr. Sharpless. I cannot do a Friday luncheon meeting. When I was on it years ago, it was always at 9 in the morning. Didn't matter really which day for me. So I just can't do that with my work and my lifestyle. So I need to give up my alternate. I had no idea when I signed up for it, and then he and I chatted, and I was like, we need to bring it up because that's not fair to the group. So I had asked them to contact Yvette, and see if someone could attend the meeting, because they called me like Thursday, and the meeting was the next day. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So I'm hoping we can get
I don't think we've missed any
Appointment?
meetings. When I talked to them, the first meeting is March 31st.
No, the
So-
first one was what was it, 2 weeks ago? He said he couldn't make it. They called me. I said I couldn't come the next day, and I gave them Yvette's phone number and asked them to follow up with her. Did you, I don't know if she. She told me yes. Okay, yeah, they've already had the first one. Yes, ma'am.
They did have the first one of it? Because when,
Yeah.
which is March 31st is the first one. So the first one's not for a while.
She told me it was that Friday.
I don't know. I'll follow up again, but when I
Okay.
talked to her, she said the first one was March 31st.
Okay.
But so it's just a 30-minute meeting. Essentially, they appoint those who will be serving as those who are adjusting the values. And then the second meeting is to approve all of those values the work that those appointees have done. Anybody dying to be nominated? Doesn't sound like
I
it.
had my hand up.
Oh, sorry.
but it's
Ms.
not
Fields.
being acknowledged. I have been given the calendar committee, and I have chosen not to serve on that committee, and you know that. And so I would be willing to do the value adjustment. If it's only for a window of 30 minutes to an hour on a Friday, I can do that.
Okay, yes, ma'am. So we'll bring back on, at our February 28th meeting to appoint Ms. Fields as the Value Adjustment Board committee member, and then I'm happy to serve as the alternate if nobody else is jumping to do it. Ms. Miller's just smiling at me, so I think that means yes. And then the second question I have is anyone interested in serving on the calendar committee for this cycle?
So I might be, I just need to know when they meet, once again.
They
Any
are,
idea?
We will issue 2 new dates because, again, the goal is to provide at least one more calendar.
Sure.
So I'll work with Mr. Warren and get those dates for you.
Sure.
I'll get them to the board, and then if it's convenient, then you can join.
I'd love to do that. Thank you.
I'll be the backup for the calendar if you need someone.
okay, so Ms. Cunningham will be the member and Ms. Miller is the backup if needed. And that one we don't have to vote on. That one's just an appointment. So I appreciate you all stepping up. All right. Mr. Sharpless, did you have anything else?
That's it, thank you.
Mr. Nolte?
I've had some teachers and paras and things, people come up to me. What is our definition? In other words, who are the community stakeholders? Who and what are they? I was having a hard time defining exactly, because they said, yeah, we see it in different articles, community stakeholders. What do I tell them?
Everyone in the community has a vested interest in public education.
Okay.
Wants to be
So I
involved.
did answer it pretty closely, correctly. And the second question I've heard from several parents and teachers and paras, many of them have heard that when ordering the new books for our schools, anything printed prior to 2014 would not be looked at. Is that clear, or is that true?
I'm sorry?
Anything written before 2014 would not be coming into the library. That's not correct, is it?
Oh, sir.
My goodness, we got so many classics out there.
Nothing in
No.
the law that speaks to that.
Right.
It is entirely possible, if not probable, that there's a great body of literature written before 2014 that would be inappropriate in our schools.
Right.
Absolutely. No, there's nothing in the statute.
But to your
that talks
point,
about
there's
that.
also a plethora of amazing books and novels and poetry that's been
Absolutely.
written that would be more than appropriate for our schools. So I don't know where that's coming from, but that's absolutely false.
Thank you.
Ms. Fields, was yours just about calendar committee, or did you have something else?
I did. I had something else. I wanted to share that I was late coming to the work session this morning because I had an opportunity to go out to Kathleen High School and the Aviation Academy to celebrate Valentine's Day with all the staff. So we were able to go to every individual room and give them a little goodie to let them know how much we love them and how much we appreciate them. So it was a great day. And Mr. Howard, I think that is something that could benefit almost every school because they were very appreciative of just that gesture. So
Yes, ma'am.
just a thought.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I want to commend Mr. Jones for being the person who spearheaded that idea along with the support of his staff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fields. That means you can't schedule any more Valentine's Day meetings, Mr. Hyde.
Without swish.
This feels Miss Swish.
Dr. Allen?
Sure. As we're talking about our committee assignments and so forth, I was reading January's minutes from the Central Florida Public School Board Coalition. And yes, indeed. So they were noting their attendance bylaw and were expressing that there were certain school districts that were not in regular attendance. So who is our
I'll have to double check. Hold on just a second.
board member that's supposed to be attending those meetings?
So going to call out names, are we?
Well, no, not now, but you can obviously send that communication out, and I just wanted to make sure that we are meeting that responsibility in accordance to their bylaws.
I'll double check. I believe Ms. Fortney was on that prior, and they
Yep.
had moved that to being a Zoom meeting. so-
Right, and there was discussion that they would go back to meeting face-to-face,
Okay.
if I remember, I don't know.
But I'll be sure to follow up on that and make sure Yvette looks. So.
I wasn't sure if anybody had reached out to us, because they said that in the in the minutes that they were reaching out to the different districts, and, okay.
Was that yesterday's meeting, though?
No, that was in January's meeting.
Just the minutes for January's.
Because I was on that meeting yesterday, if I recall correctly.
It also may be that they don't have updated, they don't have our updated names of who it is, so we'll double check on that and make sure that they know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Anyone else have any comments, questions, good of the orders? All right, seeing none, this work session is adjourned.
Too bad.